Lawmakers here in the Senate have been working on 3 appropriations bills, spending bills, all rolled into one, which includes funding for agriculture, commerce, and justice, also the Transportation Department and the Housing and Urban Development Department. More work on this is expected tomorrow, and Majority Leader Harry Reid hopes to finish work on it by the end of the week. Some of our Road to the White House coverage, live coverage over the next few days. Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney will hold a town hall meeting in Sioux City, Iowa. That's tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time, live on C-SPAN and cspan.org. Also, Representative Ron Paul will speak at an event at the University of Iowa in Iowa City Friday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern, live on C-SPAN and cspan.org. And then on Saturday evening at 7 Eastern Time, the Iowa Faith and Freedom Coalition will hear from 6 Republican presidential candidates. We'll have that live on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Radio, and cspan.org from the Iowa State Fairgrounds in Des Moines.
asking that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, their time has been set aside for the Heather Higginbottom nomination. I had not intended to speak tonight, but it's been suggested that we might get started on that and provide more time tomorrow for other business in the Senate. So I'll share my remarks tonight for the record, and hopefully we can have a good discussion of it further tomorrow. The Constitution makes it very clear that it is the President who nominates. That confirmation does not occur, however, without the consent of the Senate. In Federalist Number 76, Alexander Hamilton wrote, quote, "To what purpose, then, to require the cooperation of the Senate? I answer that the necessity of their concurrence would have a powerful, though in general silent operation. It would be an excellent check upon a spirit of favoritism in the President and would tend greatly to prevent the appointment of unfit characters from state prejudice, from family connection, from personal attachment, or from a view to popularity." Close quote. In other words, the Senate does have a duty to evaluate the President's nominees. Unfortunately, the situation we face today with the nomination of Heather Higginbottom to be the Deputy Director for the Office of Management and Budget is one of those cases. I do not know her personally, but let me state from the outset that I have no questions about her character. She has many admirers. Senator Kerry, for whom she worked, is an admirer, and I respect that. The President has certainly seeks her appointment and has asked me to try to see that that appointment moves along. I respect his desire to have an up or down vote and have agreed that we would have this vote and have agreed for some time. But my concern is with the nominee's budgetary experience. It is the lack of experience that causes me to voice my opposition. Let me first mention the OMB. The Office of Management and Budget has the primary responsibility to assist the President in overseeing the preparation of the federal budget. This is a huge responsibility. In helping the President formulate his spending plan, OMB must evaluate the effectiveness of agency programs, policies, and procedures, assess competing funding demands among all these agencies, and set the priorities and help the President. OMB is not in charge, the President is, but in reality, OMB is the one that raises the concerns with overspending with the various federal agencies. They submit their request, and then the OMB says yay or nay, and it's a very serious matter because very important people are asking for money. And sometimes you just have to say no to very prominent cabinet people. And all the cabinet people can appeal to the President, but they don't do it often. They recognize that OMB is a place where most of these matters have to be decided, and that OMB speaks on behalf of the President. Ms. Higginbottom's experience points to someone who has been on the wrong side, however, of fiscal restraint. Instead of crafting policies to decrease spending, she has been focused on new programs to increase spending. In her Budget Committee questionnaire, she was asked about her qualifications for the job. She cited her legislative and political experience. I believe she worked in a presidential campaign at one point, but cited no direct budgetary knowledge and provided no examples of developing a budget. In one pre-hearing question, I asked Ms. Higginbottom, quote, "Your background is in education and public policy. Outside of your legislative and political experience, have you acquired any budget training, including classes or continuing education?" Close quote. She responded with one sentence, "I am not taking any formal continuing education classes on the budget." I asked her whether she was the primary budget staffer during her tenure in the Senate. She essentially gave a non-answer to that. It doesn't appear that she was deeply involved as a general office Senate staffer in budgetary matters, not the primary staffer, and not a staffer whose senator served on the Budget Committee. In another pre-hearing question, she was asked whether, as a nation, we needed to focus on deficit reduction rather than new spending. She responded by deferring to the President's FY12 budget, stating that it, quote, begins the challenging but essential process of adjusting spending to achieve fiscal sustainability immediately with a 5-year freeze of non-security discretionary spending, close quote. Now, this is the same budget that adds to the debt every single year and has substantial deficits every single year. During her confirmation hearing before the Budget Committee, in which I was the ranking Republican, she continued to use President Obama's incorrect formulations. And I use that phrase kindly. She testified that President Obama's fiscal FY12 budget, the one he submitted in January, would pay down the debt and, quote, puts us on a path to stabilize our debt, close quote. But this is the same budget proposal that, by OMB's own estimate, has a deficit of approximately $800 billion in year 10 of the 10-year budget. And not a single deficit in the 10 years of this budget that was submitted to us falls below $600 billion. I would just note that, for example, $600 billion is larger than any deficit President Bush ever had. So in the 10 years, the lowest budget deficit projected by President Obama's Office of Management and Budget is $600 billion, the lowest. Surely a more experienced, skilled, and serious nominee, one that's acquainted with the great debt threat we have in America, would recognize that these deficits are irresponsible, and you can't say that we're living within our means or we are on a path to stabilize our debt. You can't say that. Even Secretary Geithner, when he testified before the Budget Committee, said the President's budget would be unsustainable if Congress passed it as written. But the Senate Budget Committee was not the only forum in which Ms. Higginbottom was given an opportunity to highlight her experience. She had a hearing before the Homeland Security Committee, and they asked about her qualifications also, which they indicated were lacking. Senator Collins asked her in opening statement, quote, the nominee's background are stated that the nominee's background, while impressive in many respects, does not include a great deal of experience in budget process or financial analysis. Senator Scott Brown used his first question to deal with her experience. He said, I noticed from your resume you have some great political experience and some really good policy experience. I was wondering if you would share with the committee, what type of accounting and budgetary experience you have, close quote. Well, she first attempted to avoid the questions, talking about her general legislative and policy experience. Senator Brown interrupted her and got to the heart of the matter. So I guess my original question is, what type of budgetary and accounting experience do you have? Ms. Higginbottom responded that she was not an accountant and that her goal was to implement the President's policy agenda through the budgetary process. And I would note that the President's policy agenda seems to be primarily to continue extraordinary new and expanded investments, spending in many, many areas of our government. After opportunity to prove that she was qualified through pre-hearing questions and through testimony at 2 confirmation hearings, she was voted out of the Homeland Security and Budget Committees on a party line vote. Our Democratic colleagues in both committees voted her out with the majorities that they had. Because of her lack of experience, not one Republican voted for her. So now a number of my colleagues have argued that the criticism is based on not lack of experience, but on her age, that somehow she's being unfairly treated because of that. And she is young for this job, but the age allegation is not correct. After her confirmation hearing, I sent her a follow-up question. Quote, some of my Democratic colleagues during your hearing before the Budget Committee indicated that when some of us questioned your experience, that we were using experience as a code word for age. The experience I'm concerned about is actual budget experience. And in a pre-hearing question, I asked you the following. This is what I said to her. I asked you this in your pre-hearing. Your background is in education and public policy. Have you acquired any budget training, including classes or continuing education? Your response was, quote, I have not taken any formal education classes. And I asked if these facts had changed, and she basically said no. She said, quote, for over a decade I've worked at the highest levels of policymaking in the United States Senate and the White House. This work has included, but was not limited to, budgetary implications of those policies. Not budget, but policy issues and budgetary implications of those policies. So the answer to the question that I ask is no, clearly. She simply does not have the kind of serious budgetary experience to be the deputy director at an office that manages a government that is spending $3,700 billion this year and taking in about $2.3 trillion, borrowing 40 cents of every dollar we spend. This is a most august position, and it requires a person who can have the confidence and judgment to say no to people who always want to spend more. Arguably, she would be the least qualified deputy director in decades. The last 2 nominees in this position had a combined 21 years of budget and finance experience. For example, Rob Neighbors, the most recent nominee, before her, served 8 years on the House Appropriations Committee and 6 years at the Office of Management and Budget. Steve McMillan, the nominee before him, served 3 years on Senate Banking Committee and 4 years at the Office of Management and Budget. Now, you learn something operating out of the Office of Management and Budget. That prepares you to have a leadership role there. Combined, Ms. Higginbottom does not have 1 year of budget or finance experience. Over the last 20 years, nominees for this position have had an average of 6.5 years of experience. Well, in certain circumstances, in certain times, maybe less experience is okay, but a time when this nation has never faced a more serious debt threat, we need real, august, serious leadership. You know, Mr. Erskine Bowles, who co-chaired President Obama's Fiscal Commission that issued a most serious report to us, warned that if the United States fails to take significant action on debt reduction, the country would face, quote, the most predictable economic crisis in its history, close quote. We're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar we spend. Our nation's gross debt is larger than the entire economy. The last thing we need now is someone who doesn't have the gravitas and to say no to those who always tend to want to spend more. That's just one of the jobs OMB has, to say no. When the Secretary of the Interior or the Secretary of the Energy comes before the Department, asking for the approval of their budget, which calls for more spending, a responsible OMB director or his deputy must be able to say no. Looking at President Obama's fiscal year 12 budget, I'm sorry to say this duty has not been met by Mr. Lieu, the director, and I can't see that he's going to get much strength and support for doing the right thing from this nominee. I supported Director Lieu, but I have been disappointed in his leadership. When the President submitted his budget to Congress, Director Lieu came before the Budget Committee and made some of the most indefensible claims that I've heard in public life. He did. Director Lieu said that the President's budget would allow us to live within our means and to begin to pay down our debts and spend only money we're taking in each year. Not one of those claims were true. Multiple fact-check organizations checked them and found them to be false. Even by OMB's own direct reckoning, the deficit would never be smaller than $600 billion at any point in the 10-year budget window. We'd not be paying down our debt. We're not going to be spending only money we're taking in each year under the President's budget. What would happen to a CEO of a corporation if they told potential investors, well, we're living within our means, we'll begin to pay down our debt, we're going to only spend money we're taking in each year, invest in our company. And people invested in the company, and they found out that there was no budget plan in place that showed anything less than huge deficits for the entire next decade, and that the company was borrowing 40 cents of every dollar that it was spending. What would happen then? I'm telling you, he would be sued, if not prosecuted, for fraud. So this is the kind of leadership we have at the budget, and I'm not happy with it. The American people should not be happy with it. They came in to spend, not look the American people in the eye and tell them of the grave financial crisis we're facing in America. Erskine Bowles, heading the commission appointed by President Obama, he told us we're on an unsustainable path. It threatens our economic future, that we are facing the most predictable financial crisis in our history. And when asked when that crisis might occur, when might we have an economic damage arising from our debt, he said 2 years, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. And Alan Simpson, Senator, his co-chairman, said, I think it could be less than 1 year. This is not a game we're playing here. We don't need government officials spinning that we're living within our means and paying down our debt. We are running up debt in a fashion never, ever, ever before done in this nation. It's unsustainable, and it's so dangerous because it's systemic, and it's so hard to get off this trend. It's demographics, it's a lot of different reasons, but it's very serious. And we need leaders in OMB who are watching every single dime that's being spent, looking for every effort in place that savings can be affected. That's what we need. And I just don't feel like this nominee fits that bill. She's a good person, she's a good, apparently, staffer, has a lot of friends, but the position of Deputy Director of OMB is a grave position. It has august responsibilities. It requires a most serious person willing to take strong stands and say no to people who want to spend more and more. When asked about our financial situation. On one of her answers, she made reference to the first stimulus bill, the Recovery Act, so-called, and this is what the nominee said. Fortunately, the Recovery Act spending has been extraordinarily transparent, enabling the public to access the job impacts of the various programs funded. Overall, the data demonstrate that the Recovery Act has delivered as promised by creating and saving millions of jobs across the country and has been an essential factor in rescuing the American economy, close quote. Well, I know the nominee is a friend and ally of the President, and I'm willing to give her a vote, and I suppose that she will be confirmed. But I just want to say, I think that's a bit of a Pollyannish description of the success of the stimulus bill. It just didn't meet those standards, and I do feel like that she's been less than rigorous in her understanding of these difficult financial issues that our nation faces. So I encourage my colleagues to join me in opposing the nomination. I thank the Chair would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
As we wait for a senator to speak, some of what happened in the Senate today, Majority Leader Reid filed a motion that'll decide whether the Senate will proceed on a bill that would provide $35 billion to states to prevent teachers and first responders from losing their jobs. That vote could come as late as Friday. A summary from Congressional Quarterly says that Republicans have objected to the bill as a, quote, bailout of struggling state governments, and also objected to its 0.5% surtax on household income above $1 million, which would pay for the bill's spending. Senate Republican Leader McConnell also took steps for a test vote as late as Friday on legislation that would strip a tax withholding requirement for government contractors. Up next, after the Senate is out on C-SPAN 2, a Senate Commerce Committee hearing on concussions in sports. Former soccer and football players talk about their experiences. Again, you can see that here on C-SPAN 2 after the Senate is out. The pending business here in the Senate is what's being called a mini-bus that combines 3 annual spending bills. Transportation Department funding is part of that federal spending package. Today, the Senate defeated an amendment offered by Senator John McCain to stop federal funds for transportation museums, highway beautification, and preservation of historic bridges. The Associated Press writing that the Arizona Republican argues that money needed to repair rundown roads was being diverted to projects like squirrel sanctuaries and car museums. Opponents of the measure said it would block Amtrak's use of many historic rail stations and the preservation of icons like the New York's Brooklyn Bridge and New England's covered bridges. So Senator McCain's amendment was defeated today by a vote of 59 to 39.
Majority Leader.
Ask consent the call of quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the Majority Leader, excuse me, after consultation with the Republican Leader, the Senate proceed to a series of votes in relation to the following amendments. Vitter 769 as modified. Webb number 750 is modified. Berkeley number 879 is modified with the changes that are there at the desk. Brown of Ohio 874 is modified with the changes that are at the desk. Moran number 815 and Grassley number 860. That there be no amendments or points of order against any of the amendments prior to the votes other than the budget points of order. That there be 2 minutes equally divided in the usual form prior to each vote. That the Vitter, Webb, Merkley, Brown, and Grassley amendments be subject to a 60-vote affirmative vote threshold. That all after the first vote be 10 minutes. Further, that the following amendments be considered and agreed to this evening. Sanders 816, Coburn 793, Coburn 798 is modified with the changes that are at the desk. Finally, the following first-degree amendments filed by Senator Coburn be in order to be called up and made pending during tomorrow's session. 794, 797, 799 through 801, and 833.
Without objection.
I have a cloture motion at the desk.
Clerk report.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on amendment number 738 to H.R. 2112, an act making appropriations for agriculture, rural development, Food and Drug Administration, and related agencies programs for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2012, and for other purposes, signed by 18 senators as
Mr.
follows.
President, I ask unanimous consent that the reading of the names be waived.
Without
I
objection.
have another cloture motion at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Just wait until it's 9:24. Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on H.R. 2112, an act making appropriations for agriculture, rural development, Food and Drug Administration, and related agencies programs for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2012, and for other purposes, signed by 18 senators as follows.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that mandatory quorum under Rule 22 be waived for both cloture petitions.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that a time be determined by the Majority Leader in consultation with the Republican Leader, the Senate proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 410, that there be 4 hours of debate equally divided in the usual form, that upon the use reading back at that time, the Senate proceed to vote without intervening action or debate on calendar number 410, that the nomination be subject to a 60-vote threshold, the motion reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order to the nomination, any statements related to the nomination be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Without objection. I
ask consent the Senate proceed calendar number 125.
Clerk report.
Calendar number 125, S894, a bill to amend Title 38 United States Code and so forth and for other purposes.
Without objection, the Senate shall proceed to the measure.
I shall consent the bill be read a third time passed. Motion reconsider be laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate. And any statements related to this matter be placed in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
Without objection.
As consent, we now go to S-Res 299.
Clerk report.
Senate Resolution 299 designating October 2011 as National Work and Family Month.
Without objection, the Senate shall proceed to the measure.
I ask consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motion reconsider be laid on the table. There be no intervening action or debate. Any statements related to this matter be placed in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
Without objection.
I shall now consent the Senate proceed to S-Res 300.
Clerk report.
Senate Resolution 300 supporting the goals and ideals of Red Ribbon Week 2011.
Without objection, the Senate shall proceed to the measure.
I shall now consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motion reconsider be laid on the table.
Without objection.
I shall now consent the Senate, when the Senate completes its business today, the Senate adjourn until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, Thursday, October 20th. I would note, Mr. President, a very unique reason we're coming in late tomorrow. I would like to come in very early. But the Senator Harkin and Senator Enzi are working very hard in the Labor Committee, Labor and Education Committee, to come up with a rewrite of the Leave No Child Behind. They've worked very, very hard. There's 140 amendments pending. More than 70 of them have been offered by one senator, and that senator has objected to the committee meeting. So it's a little hard when you file all those amendments how they're going to be considered when you object to the committee meeting. Under the rules of the Senate, you have a right to object if the meeting takes more than 2 hours after the Senate comes into session. So anyway, that's where we are. I think it's absolutely hard to comprehend how anyone could rationally do that, but that's what we have. So anyway, we're coming in at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Following the prayer and the pledge, journal proceedings we approved today. Morning hour be deemed expired. The time for the two leaders be reserved for use later in the day. And I would also add, because of that, the committee's meeting very, very early so that they can go continue 2 hours after we come in. Following any leader remarks, the Senate resumed consideration H.R. 2112. And that at 12 p.m. the Senate proceed to executive session to consider account number 78. There will be 2 minutes of debate, divided and controlled in the usual form, with a vote on confirmation of the nomination. Further, that when the Senate resumes legislative session, the Senate will go to H.R. 2112 and proceed to vote in relation to the Vitter Amendment and the Webb Amendment. And at 2 p.m. the Senate proceed to vote in relation to the Merkley Amendment and the Brown of Ohio Amendment and the Moran Amendment and the Grassley Amendment, with all other provisions of the previous order remaining in effect.
Without objection.
Quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Kaka.
Mr. President, ask
Majority Leader.
consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
In relation to the previous business that was conducted here a few minutes ago regarding Cal number 410, I ask that be modified that the previous agreement to remove references to the motion to reconsider, that we would take that out of my consent agreement.
Without objection.
Call votes about noon tomorrow, 4 roll call votes, approximately 2 p.m. We expect additional roll call votes tomorrow in relation to the appropriations bill. We're going to do our utmost to complete that bill tomorrow. If there's no further business come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.
Senate stands adjourned until October 20th, Thursday, 10 a.m.
Lawmakers have been working on 3 appropriations bills rolled into one, which includes